Right, I'll start now, I think, and we'll just have to go from there, basically. So, so good afternoon, learners. The session today we're going to be looking at is on quantitative research methods, and and in the session we'll have the following objectives, really. So we're going to try to understand, or at least by the end of the session, you'll be able to understand the principles and characteristics of quantitative research, explore various quantitative research designs and methods, and then hopefully be able to discuss best practices and considerations for conducting quantitative research studies. So for those who are doing quantitative research studies, well, it's not just about those doing quantitative research studies. I think it's for everybody. Um, yeah, the session is literally about considering what you need to think about as you design your study, but also as you go about developing your analysis and the study design to implement um, the quantitative research method that you are going to employ. So in today's session, we'll focus on these and hopefully we'll be able to build on your understanding and knowledge about what it is that you need to do to deliver for your DBA study. So yeah, so the agenda will follow the following. So we'll look at the introduction to quantitative research, some types of quantitative research designs, and then choosing the right quantitative research design to ensure that you are um, doing what is required. And when I say doing what is required, I'm looking at the quantitative research methods guidance around what is permissible and what is not, and some of the things to think about in terms of examples of research that has been looking at these types of quantitative methods. So making sure also then in terms of the types of quantitative research methods that you are aware of what they are as in what's available, but then also looking at the right kind of quantitative research design for your particular project and what makes it so, as in what makes it appropriate. We look at data collection and analysis. And by that, what we're looking for is to explain what kind of data collection methods they are, and then some of the analysis methods that is required to be able to design a study that is fit for purpose and also meets the requirements. Now, as part of that, and how we would know whether or not you are being appropriate, there are some very important aspects called sensitivity checks on the data that you've collected, but also the analysis methods that you've used to see and ensure whether they are valid or reliable or reliable. And so we'll look at that and look at what some of the examples are that you need to consider in terms of your data around what makes your study valid, but also how do we know that it is reliable, given that you have got a set of data that you've analyzed. What did it look like then in terms of your study to be valid and reliable? We'll then consider the last aspects, which they aren't insurmountable. They are quite important as well. We need to look at what's known as ethical considerations and how we can ensure that in our study for quantitative research method that we are meeting the ethical requirements in terms of being um, appropriate for quantitative research studies. We'll then do a recap and consider some Q&A potentially. Um, okay. So just in terms of the introduction to quantitative research methods then, so just to remind ourselves, I think we probably would have looked at some of this before, but quantitative research is a systematic investigation that primarily focuses on quantifying relationships, behaviors, phenomena, trends, and is often conducted through numerical data analysis. And here we're talking about quantifying relationships, or the relationships between variables, the behaviors of people, in terms of what it is that they either believe or do or are intending to do in terms of the behaviors. We might look at phenomena. So this might be work-life balance, or it might be something that looks at um, trends around stress management and well-being, or trends in terms of worker behaviors around sick leave or and so on. But the point is that this research method is about quantifying what is happening. So whether that is through a survey or whether that's through secondary analysis or something else like a longitudinal analysis, the idea is that you're quantifying the patterns and the data itself to try to understand what's actually happening there. So the purpose for doing this kind of research, and when I say this kind of research, I mean quantitative research, is to test hypotheses, identify patterns, make predictions, and or provide some conclusions that can be generalized to larger populations. So we talk about the last or the latter part as known as inferential statistics, meaning that you're inferring from your sample to the population. Hypotheses, these are problem statements, and generally in quantitative research, we want to test our models by explaining what's the hypothesis that we are presenting. So we've had a discussion before, but the main thing here around your hypothesis is that it's problem statements that you create based on what has been done before in terms of supported research. And when I say supported research, what I mean is that there are previous studies that have done this type of research and they have found an effect or they haven't found an effect. And so therefore your hypothesis based on what has been done before, the direction of either the associations between the variables or the patterns that you will expect to find given the research that you're looking at and also what has been written before. So obviously in your sample, you can't really know exactly how people will respond to your set of questions, but what you will have is you will have a idea from what has been written before, as in what others have found, given that you are asking the same questions. So if you are asking the same questions, you'd expect to find some kind of proximate relationships that should be proximal, meaning that they are directly or they are should be similar to what previous studies have found, given the same set of circumstances. So same scales, we would expect similar results. If there are no, if there are changes, then that's interesting, and that's what you will report on in terms of your findings to be able to then give some kind of indication about why it is different to previous studies. So here's some examples of a management study that investigates and tests how attitudes to social media overuse affects worker well-being. In this example, what we're looking at is we're looking at testing the relationship around the attitudes to social media overuse and how it affects worker well-being. Again, so just to come back, we are then identifying what the problems are from hypotheses. We'll test the model that we have created around social media overuse and worker well-being. So there's a connection between the two, and we will test them given your hypothesis. So in this example, that's the plan. Okay, so the purpose again is to do these things. It's also to identify patterns in the data itself, right? So in some cases, we will do even simple descriptive statistics or explanatory kind of analysis. And in that explanatory analysis, what we are doing, we're explaining what these relationships are for what it is that we found. So might do a survey and test from that survey, find out what the population of, or at least that sample, what that sample thinks about either the behaviors or the relationships or the phenomena or trends really around what it is that we're trying to find out. So in our case here, social media overuse, how it affects worker well-being. We would then say we were trying to understand from the patterns which groups of people are most affected and how. Okay, so we will explain that given what we have, but we will have these questions that we are asking of this particular sample in the survey, and we will compare and contrast our findings based on what we have from the results of those different groups. So we might have a gender difference, we might have an age, or might have some kind of generation effects, or otherwise we could also have what's known as some some trends that emerges from unexpected findings rather than expected findings. And what we're looking to do is to understand what they are talking about. In terms of predictions, we might also look at what's known as future behaviors or future trends or future expectations based on our findings. So what we do is we do some modeling, what's known as modeling of our data through what's known as regression analysis, or something more elaborate than that. We might look at structural equation modeling or some kind of multiple regression analysis as well, which looks to predict what it is that we are trying to understand or find. So in this prediction, we might look at what future behavior might look like, given the pattern of the answers that we have looked at in our study. We will look at that and analyze that data to give us some kind of modeling of what we would expect. So in that predictive models, what we will look at then to show is how there's some kind of fitting of that model, and then also the prediction based on the regression analysis that we are doing, or structural equation modeling. The structural equation models, basically what they do is they look at not only the direction of the independent variable and the independent variables, but they also look at the direction in both directions. And so what I mean by that is, so it's not just about the context of attitudes to social media overuse, but it's also looking at how social media overuse affects the attitudes and therefore well-being. So it's the direction is forward and backwards in terms of the association and the logic itself. So, so the prediction, and in this case, structural equation modeling looks at the associations not just in the direction of that which is to be regressed or that which is to be predicted in terms of the outcome variable. So in this case, worker well-being. It is also about looking at well-being in the relationships that is inverse as well. So it's not just one direction, but it's also the other direction, and looking at what those relationships looks like in terms of the strength of those relationships, meaning how strongly correlated they are or how weakly correlated they are, strength, but then also the direction in terms of whether it's positive, negative, or neutral in terms of the direction as well. Okay. So we talk about these quantitative research in terms of having some different types, right? So we have characteristics around the structure design, objective measurements, numerical data, and data sources, right? So the structure design, meaning that um, the design that is followed in terms of quantitative research is generally quite fixed, as in it's quite formulaic. It follows a pattern, and it's a fixed design with predefined variables and methods, right? And what I mean by it follows a fixed design is that it actually has got predefined ways of analyzing and determining what the variables are that can be studied and how it is to be studied. So we have to do a lot of cleaning of that variables in order to get it to the point where you can actually use it. There are key methods for how you would actually go about doing it. So in terms of objective measurements, these objective measurements uses data that has been determined to be objective. So what that means is that it's not about influencing the data by confounding variables or personal bias. In essence, you, the researcher or the interviewer, you're not going to be manipulating that data or adding to that by being able to interfere with the data itself. Invariably, you'd ask the sample to do the survey, they'll do it, and then you come back and you measure what they have said. It's not going to be about trying to explain all kinds of other aspects as well. Let's put it this way, you're not going to be able to manipulate the data um, by directly influencing the survey participants, or at least you shouldn't. That is not how we would do this properly. So there's numerical data. So primarily involves the data that can be quantified and analyzed statistically. So we're not looking for the stories of the participants. We're asking them specific questions, and these items or questions are targeted to be able to give us some kind of in, indication about what they've either their behaviors or their attitudes or their own personal information is about. So it tends to be quite objective in the essence. It is trying to understand their views. So we are asking them subjective in some respects about their feelings or their behaviors or their attitudes, but objective in the sense that we aren't adding to it by asking and interfering with their process of answering those questions. So it's at arm's length. We ask them the questions and we get their feedback based on what we are asking for with no other interference involved. Sorry, excuse me. So the data sources, so we use both primary data, meaning that we collect this data firsthand, or secondary data, use secondary data. Secondary data is from existing sources, stuff like either statistics that has been already been collected or data such as reports that are available freely on the web or website information that's available already, such as social media and so on. So there's different data sources that we will use or can use in terms of quantitative research. The main ones would be the primary data, where we are either collecting it directly from the respondents in terms of surveys or experiments, or secondary data, where we're looking at existing data and pulling that in. So here's an example of what this potentially might look like. So we'd look at a quantitative study on employee well-being that tests the factors affecting job satisfaction based on employee behaviors. So in this example, what we're looking to do is to understand well-being, but also testing what specific factors have an effect. And when I say in an effect, I mean what affects how that job satisfaction works, and then what it relates to in terms of employee behaviors. So job satisfaction and employee behavior, they are interlinked. And so in our study on well-being, we'll look at these factors to see what actually has an effect on the employee behaviors. So we talk about the independent variable and the dependent variable in this context, and the independent variables are they are changing, they are able to affect the dependent variable. So here we have the role of quantitative research now. Talk about this. So the role is to do the following. We test some hypotheses. So in quantitative research, provide a framework for testing a hypothesis through statistical methods. So when we say this, what we are actually saying is we've got a model. In our model, the main thing about that model is it looks at specific things. And when I say specific things, we have modeled the relationships based on the supporting literature, based on what we know about those variables that we are looking at or constructs. When I say constructs, what I mean is that they are a group of variables that are predefined based on being a combined set of items that is um, robust and connected to a particular type of phenomenon. So if we're talking about life satisfaction, there'll be a group of variables that speaks to certain behaviors, such as stress. Um, and when I say stress, it could be about distress, or it could be eustress. It could be about happiness. So we have a set of questions that speaks to happiness. We have a construct for employee well-being. We have a construct that looks at social media engagement, for example. These are all examples of constructs. Generally, we test them by these hypotheses. So the hypotheses will determine what direction we're expecting the constructs and variables to relate to each other. We set them up in terms of a model. This model is generally a visual model in quantitative research. And when we have this visual model, then in that visual model, they will show the relationships, but also with arrows and lines between the variables and constructs to show what the relationships are, and also to present how we are thinking about our hypotheses or what we are predicting will happen. We then do analyses such as regression analysis, t-tests, and ANOVAs to help validate or reject our hypothesis based on the data analysis. And what I mean by this is that we have the data that we collect from our either the sample or the secondary data that we have. We analyze that using methods such as regression, such as t-tests. T-tests are a method that we use and employ to understand the differences between groups. We do the same with ANOVAs as well. So it's called an ANOVA test, but it can also be called the Fisher test, which is basically the score that you will get at the end of your analysis of variance. So the analysis of variance is literally a group um, analysis, or group by group, or inter and intra group analysis. So what we want to understand, if we're talking about gender differences in behavior on well-being, we might look at what are the gender differences between males and females, or we might look at age differences even. In that case, we probably run a MANOVA, meaning a multivariate analysis of variance, where we've got multiple categories of the variable that we are looking at to validate. So in the age arrangement, we might have multiple categories of age, which we determine. So it might be early adulthood, mid adulthood, and older adulthood, something like that. And we break it down by the groups, and then we would analyze that using a MANOVA. And then based on the findings, we'll find out whether or not there are differences, and where there are differences, what it is like in terms of the what's known as the inter differences, but also the intra differences, meaning we would look at what are the differences between age across the three groups, but also look at it within the same group to be able to understand whether there are differences even within the same group and what that might look like. So we'll do that. Based on those analysis, we will then accept or reject, or validate or reject our hypothesis. So we talk about this in terms of either we support or refute our hypothesis. Our hypotheses are supported or they are refuted. Generalization. So from our findings, we look to then generalize to larger populations when the sample is representative. The point here is it has to be representative, and we can determine this by developing samples that are robust enough and that are represented in terms of the selection process. So what I mean by that is that when you come to selecting your sample, in order to have a representative sample, you do need to think about, well, what are some of the aspects that you need to consider? And when I say aspects, I mean the consideration of your sample and looking at the sample in terms of representation by group, but also by region, by age, gender, and so on. So, and we look at this in terms of stratified random sampling or random sampling, but it will be by a specific method. So you'd have to have a look at this in detail to be able to give you that representation to organize your data. So here's an example of what the role of this kind of process would look like if we are looking to understand how we do hypothesis testing and the analysis and then the generalization. So an example of a study that would look at something like this is a study that one of the recent ones on explaining how a startup company's leadership style evolves over time by considering how motivation is experienced by both founders and employees. So in the study and in what it is that is looking at here, we are looking at the leadership styles over time. So you can see that there are different kinds of leadership style. So we know that there'll be multiple options, at least so we would hope. We're also looking at it over time, meaning that there's some kind of longitudinal arrangement or panel arrangement. And then what's the motivation is experienced by both founders and employees. So we know that there's two different groups, right? So for this kind of analysis, we could do either regression analysis, could do an ANOVA, and ANOVA would cover the ideas around comparing the means of the different groups. So the mean of the founders, the mean of the employees, and looking at the leadership styles as well. So the point is that the ANOVA would analyze your data by group, and the by group aspect is then yeah, so it'll show you where there are clear differences and whether they are statistically significant or not. The point here is that we want to analyze this to be able to generalize what it is that we have found to our population from the sample survey that we've created. Okay, so there are different kinds of quantitative research that we need to look at. And when I say different kinds, I mean different designs or different methods. Okay. So when we talk again, just to remind ourselves that quantitative research is about trying to understand and to quantify the relationships between our data points, as in literally what we have found, and also to be able to give us an explanation or prediction or some kind of description of the variables to be able to talk about a phenomenon, a behavior, or an attitude of our sample. These are the main quantitative research methods. There are others. We're not going to go into the others because I figure that we in your DBA, in most cases, people will be doing one of the following types of research. And when I say types of research, I mean this within the quantitative method or the positivist paradigm, you'll be looking at one of the following types of research methods. The first one is known as the experimental design. It's widely used in the social sciences. And when I say the social sciences, I mean the studies that look at psychology, sociology. They use it quite frequently. Um, More recently, in the management area, it has started becoming more connected or of more use, especially in the social media space currently, but also other areas. So what is it, basically, in terms of the experimental design? It's a design that tests causal relationships by manipulating independent variables to observe effects on dependent variables. So we might look at this in terms of shopping behaviors. So an experiment that looks at shopping behaviors might look at something like when we apply a sales element or we change the price of the products, what does it look like or what does it change in terms of the behavior of the respondents and which ones? So we might look at this in terms of creating a randomized assignment for that. And what I mean by a randomized assignment is we might give, we might not have specific people in mind for the change. We might look at giving everybody the equal opportunity to get into and to be able to give feedback on our experiment. So we would have random assignment, so it won't be so just in terms of the experiment itself, there tends to be a treatment group and an experimental group. In most cases, what happens is the treatment group gets some kind of an effect or some kind of training or some kind of modification. The control group gets nothing. What happens is, so for example, when we are looking at trying to change behaviors over time, if we're looking at an experiment on well-being, for example, we might look at in the treatment group giving them some kind of methods and well-being training around the kind of management of stress and also giving them some ideas around what to do in terms of methods to manage stress. So we might measure them before we've done the treatment. So we'll measure a group or have a group that is a control group. So we call them X and we have the treatment group Y. In the treatment group Y, we have some intervention or some kind of treatment of sorts. And in that treatment plan, we'll then test the effects of what happens in week 1, where there's no effect between both our studied groups. And what we want to look at is over time whether there are changes that happens as a result of the treatments. But the point is we want to be able to understand whether our treatment has got an effect. And the only way we can do that is to look at what's the changes that's happened, not only in the group that we are treating, but also seeing whether or not there's a change from where we started in terms of the group that is our control group. So, and this is how this experiments normally happens, is that we have this to be able to explain also and enhance our internal validity. So the point here is that you have these two experimental groups and we test them over time with what's known as a schedule. And that schedule or protocol is predefined in terms of saying we're going to do this experiment over the next 12 weeks and we're going to look at how our experimental group and our treatment group, or sorry, our control group and our treatment or experimental group changes over time. And we also want to see whether the treatment that we're giving has got an effect in terms of changing the behaviors or changing the mood or changing the expression or the stress levels of these participants over time. So yeah, so there's experiment types and what it does, the applications have been used in marketing, and there's an example of a study that has done this, operations experiments. So again, in terms of operations experiments, just to think about it, we want to look at whether or not changes in our design around, for example, the most recent examples around operations are around the effects of shorter supply chains. So we know that during the pandemic, for example, there were supply chain issues, and these supply chain issues was exacerbated because with the lockdowns, there wasn't the opportunity to be able to develop these chips in this to the same degree. And so there was a shortage of chips, and then there was a long lead-in time as well to actually get those chips into factories and manufacturing because of the long distances. So there was logistical issues basically. Um, Ultimately, this has led now to people employing two things. One is just in time, and that was always the case that prior to the pandemic, there was a just-in-time kind of production method, meaning that people would produce or use the production, but just at the time when they needed the product or service. But the challenge with that was that through the pandemic, it became obvious that that led to problems because of the lack of being able to produce fast enough with a shutdown. That led to other options, such as looking at storing the product and yeah, and doing things differently. So these experiments were then done in order to understand how long that lead-in times are and what that might look like through simulation as well. Um, so yeah, some other experimental designs are also on organizational behavior studies. And when we look at this, you might find that there's some studies that you would have seen around organizational behavior. And when I say organizational behavior, it could be as simple as looking at employee well-being around behaviors such as working from home versus working in the office, and how much that has affected people and changed their not just their behavior but also their socialization and what that means. So there's some experimental designs that have been developed specifically to look at these kind of behaviors and what these changes look like. There's lots happening at the moment in this space. Um, yeah, just to know that that's an option. The difficulty with this design, though, is it does require a lot of ethical approval and very, very sensitive kinds of looking at how this design would actually work, because you'd need to have quite a lot of experience to be able to pull this off properly. Then we look at other types of research, descriptive statistics or descriptive research. This is a quantitative design used to generally characterize what's happening in the population or looking at a phenomenon within their population. So, for example, we might look at what's the differences between um, yeah, so what are the patterns of employee salaries over time, but also the differences between the genders on salary. So in terms of describing the population, we might look at what's the population in terms of those who are working versus those who are not working. Then we might look at what's the proportion then of those who are on higher salaries versus lower salaries and so on. So and what kind of work they're doing as well. So we might look at this, and this will be generally observational or non-experimental. And what I mean by the observational, meaning that we'll observe it from we'll look at that data, analyze that data, and then be able to give us a feedback on what these differences look like over time. If we wanted to look at, for example, the recruitment and retention policies or the recruitment and retention plans and strategies for organizations within an industry, such as the HR arrangements. We have surveys on that. And then for that, we would then be able to talk about what's the retention rates and by industry, and what are the salaries per industry, and so on. So the point is, what is the retention rates and what are some of these employee factors that we can consider from an HR perspective. Um, so we can use surveys, observations to gather that data. And when I say observations, some of these observations are not physical observations. It might be observations that are collected through other means, such as through cameras, through smartphone use, through certain other behaviors that we can kind of capture that data. So there are in footfall kind of analysis, we have sensors on buildings where we can pick up on what the footfall is. So yeah, those are examples as well. So if we kind of go and want to understand, well, so how many people have gone through a museum today, we can pick that up through that sensors as opposed to having to manually sit and click there. How many people had actually gone through. So these are examples of how you would do this type of research. Sorry, excuse me. Um, and would use this type of research for market analysis. And so in the market analysis here, to describe what the ages of the people were and what what the time was that they spent in different parts of the museum and so on, and give you some kind of profile of the demographic information as well. So here's an example again, looking at the description of the current means and standard deviations of the data on recruitment and retention of employees in our department. So this is an example where we want to look at, and when I say current means, just to know, the mean is basically the average of a set of data points. So we have a set of data points, so there's 20, and we've got our would want to know what the mean is of that data points. We'd then look at the responses of that 20 people. And in that 20 people, if on average they've given responses between 0 and 4, and our average is 3.5, we'd say that's quite high. That's an example of the mean that we would look at. The standard deviation generally is what is known as the error around the mean. So we would look at what is the distribution around how far our error rates might be for what we are observing given our mean score, and therefore what we would expect as being the upper limit and lower limit in terms of standard error. There's a formula that we apply for that. I'm not going to go into all of that now, but the point is what we need, or what we normally show in terms of descriptive statistics and descriptive research, is the means, the mode, and the median of our data. In a table, generally for this kind of research, the DBA, we would expect to see at least the mean and the standard deviation and a bivariate table. So the bivariate table would be having all your variables across and all your variables going down and numbers on top, and within the variables itself going down. And then you would have some kind of indication of the relationships between those variables about whether they are statistically significant or not, and what's the association in terms of the score itself. So bivariate meaning between the two, there's a relationship analysis, there's a correlation, and that correlation table would provide your standard deviation and your mean of each of those variables, all your variables in your study, and then you would look at the differences between the mean and the standard deviation, but also giving your significance of your data in terms of what it is that you have. Okay. So the next one that we're going to look at is correlation studies. So I think we just spoke about that now, but the point here with a correlation analysis is that we're looking to understand the relationship between two or more variables without manipulation. So we're not manipulating it in any way. All we want to know is, what are the relationships? What are the associations between X and Y? So we'd have it on a graph, and we'd have X and Y. So your Y axis and your X axis. And what we're trying to understand really is that whether there is a relationship, and if there is a relationship, what does it look like? So what it does is it identifies and measures the strength of relationships using correlation coefficients. So when I say strength, what I mean here is whether there is a weak relationship, a medium relationship, or a strong relationship between the variables. These correlation coefficient is your coefficient that gives your outcome of what relationships are. The relationship between your correlation you'd have a value of R. In that R, the measure is between -1 and +1. When I'm talking about the direction here, we would want to know whether the relationship between these variables are positive or negative or neutral. And in other words, positive means that there is a relationship that's positive, they're connected positively. If there's no relationship, it will have 0, and therefore there isn't a relationship between the two variables that we can observe, or it's negative between the relationships that we're observing. In that negative one, um, yeah, we can talk then about the size of that relationships as well. And in terms of that size, it will have a size figure of between -1 to +1, +1 being the most positive relationship between the two variables, and -1 being the most negative between the variables. There could be a no relationship whatsoever, and that no relationship between the two means it's 0. So at this point, if you are looking at it, if we're talking about the relationships and we're saying that there is a relationship, we want to know whether it's positive, negative, or whether there's a weak relationship. And there are key statistics that we use for that. So up to uh, 0.33, so 0 to 0.25, and then 0.026 to 0.33. That would be a weak relationship. Um, so the very weak relationship is between 0 and 0.025. Still positive, but weak. Then we have a medium relationship between 0.26 and zero point 0.5. That's more or less low to medium relationship. And then a medium relationship, medium positive relationship, 0.51 to 0.6 would be positive but medium, and so on. So, and then the higher relationship, 0.75 onwards, really high. The correlation matrix that you create will pick up on these, and you need to explain what's the connection. It doesn't automatically imply causation, as in that there is a causal link or inference between the relationship between the two variables. Just because there's a high correlation between variable A and variable B doesn't automatically mean that because there is a high relationship that the change in A is caused by the change in B. It's not true. The two are related to each other, but they're as in positively connected, but they're not affecting each other directly. So therefore, there's no positive or direct causal links between them. So that's important that you understand that. We'll look at typical applications of what correlational studies might look like. So in employee satisfaction and performance studies, we'd look at consumer behavior research, and we'd also look at financial analysis. So in the financial analysis, we might look at what is the relationship between the different variables. And when I say the different variables, what I mean is the relationship between your financial position in terms of profit and loss, as well as looking at yeah, so looking at your reporting measures on the different variables that you are looking at in terms of performance. So the key performance indicators, such as your profit statement, so and growth, and so you might look at your net sales position, or yeah, the point here is that you are looking at your key performance indicators to be able to understand the health of the organization. So whether there's growth or whether the the performance meets the requirements, whether or not there is profit or whether you're going backwards, right? So those are the key ones. Um, yeah, so here's an example at the bottom where we're looking at this, exploring productivity, for example, of employee motivation at different times of the day. So if you're looking at motivation and you're thinking, well, actually, when are my employees most highly motivated? Are they more highly motivated in the morning or highly motivated in the afternoon? Or is there, well, not really much of a difference? It is some other variable that explains the difference between their motivation and their productivity. And it might not be about the productivity during a day. We need to look at it over time, such as a month, a year, or something else. And therefore, we're not even look at this, maybe looking at something else. Longitudinal studies, these are interesting. Just to be clear, I don't think you will do a longitudinal study because it involves at least 5 to 7 years of data collection. So the research design that collects data from the same subjects over an extended period, it tends to be between 5 and 7 years, and it can be longer in terms of longitudinal studies. So you would probably know of some of the income surveys as being classical ones in terms of longitudinal studies. The income studies would look at how people's income changes over time. And it doesn't matter which country you're from, we all track, there's some kind of formal process or formal survey that tracks the income over time. And yeah, so the OECD might be one place where you can go and look at this data. Your National Statistics Office will offer something that's also speaks to this. And the idea is that we're looking at income over time and how they changed based on inflation. And it could be for the same types of jobs or could be different jobs. And so the key here is the longitudinal studies are studies that looks at not a one point in time relationship in terms of collecting that data, but it collects data more or less at the same point in time, but over a period of time. So what I mean by that is we might be looking at collecting data in the same month, but over a period of 5 to 7 years. So that's what makes it longitudinal. Now, there are panel studies as well that also looks at the same kind of feature, but what's different about panel studies is that it doesn't have to track the same um, people. It's not the same people in that study over time. It might be the same organization. Um, and so what we were trying to do with the panel study is it's the similar in terms of exploring the relationships of these individuals over time. But what it is that we're doing with the panel study is that it's tracking the a different metric effectively compared to longitudinal studies. So the features of that longitudinal studies are that it allows for observations and changes that develops over time, right? So we know that income changes, like I've spoke about before, based on inflation, and therefore in inflationary environments that are high, we would expect the income to also progress along similar lines. When income drops, or at least inflation drops, there's a dip or drop off in the level of increases in income. Okay. What we have as part of this set is that longitudinal studies can be used for both experimental and observational studies. Okay. So when we're saying observational or at least experimental, we might track these different people or different groups of people, and therefore we can do experiments to try and understand what's changed over time. So the environment, for example, like inflation or the political landscape might have changed, and therefore we're tracking and we'll set up an experiment to be able to explore and explain what's happening in terms of changes. So the unemployment rate might drop off or it might decrease. in environments where it's more magnificent. And what I mean by magnificent is we're talking about environments that where there's higher growth in the economy. So GDP is higher, productivity is higher, uh, and the produce index is higher as well. What then happens invariably is there's a general uptake in terms of there being more jobs available as well. We look at this also from the observational studies in terms of longitudinal studies, and here we can observe what's happening in terms of changes over time. What I mean by that is that we will look at how the price of goods have affected people in terms of income, if we're looking at that. And we might also look at the changes in terms of behavior. So another example of a study that might be longitudinal might be the price of houses, right? So and it doesn't matter where you are, the price of housing has changed. There's an index that's created based on the price of the houses in the country. And the reason for that is that you want to try and reduce the amount of noise that because you have high priced housing and you have low priced housing and you have somewhere in the middle. So in effect, you create an index to track more or less the mean um, price of a house over time. So the index itself has got other factors that also comes into play in order to control for that size, but also to have something that reduces the levels of error variance as well. Something that I can explain later on, but the point here is that these indices are created to understand the longitudinal arrangement of the price of houses. And so my point around this is that there are typical applications of this to be able to understand whether or not there is an affordability aspect to the price of housing, whether they are affordable or to what degree they are not affordable, because we can track that based on what's the median price of the house and also what's the income, the median income, and we can then develop a ratio around that to be able to explain what's the difference between them. Other applications of this longitudinal studies are to track changes over time, consumer behavior over time, career progression studies. So just to come back to the consumer behavior over time, we might want to look at how shopping behaviors have changed over time. So we can look at how and what people bought in terms of their basket of goods. And so consumer price index is one example of what that might look like in terms of a basket of goods. And literally, we used to track it in terms of a basket of goods with certain products that we had in that basket to be able to explain what a typical shopping uh, experience looks like for a household. And therefore, the basket of goods would include certain services and the goods as well. So would include that as part of the what's known as the consumer price index. That consumer price index has changed over time and products and services have come in and out over time. I don't think anybody had a broadband account in early 1990s because the broadband wasn't around. But now we talk about it, and we've included it in what we have these days. So again, some of the other products that we have changed over time. So there wasn't a need for some of the products that we have now. But some of the core products are still in there. Price of milk and bread is still included. Um, yeah, some aspects have changed, but it's tracking this basket of goods and how much it costs basically per household to be able to explain what that consumer price index uh, looks like in terms of change over time. Um, Yes, so in an example of another longitudinal study, so one of my studies that I've looked at was to look at an investigation of performance and growth of a SME manufacturing business or set of businesses over a period of time. So these were startups basically, and in the startup phase, what we wanted to track is what does the change look like over time. So we've looked at the change for growth in terms of 7 years from when they started, and we tried to understand whether or not they had shifted in terms of becoming successful or whether they had failed, and at which point did they fail. So the factors contributing were obviously we were looking at it from the perspective of the employee, or sorry, the entrepreneur, because they in these startup businesses, most of the time they start out with one person who owns that business and then develops that business over time. So as they grow, they'll increase and add FTE or headcount, and also as they're growing, they'll get cash flow, make more sales, and then they'll need more people. But early on, what we're trying to do is to try and understand, well, what does it look like in terms of growth, and when do they fail? And if they are failing, what does that look like? And if they are successful, what does that look like as well? So what do they do that's different to each other? It's an interesting study. I think you should have a look. It is available to you in the reference list as well. Okay. So the next one we're looking at is in terms of the quantitative research, we're also looking at using questionnaires or interviews, right? So you can reach a large sample here. Um, and so would use structured questions and questionnaires to yield quantitative data. And then the application of that is to then use that for the engagement of surveys to extract feedback. Now, this could be quarterly surveys, it could be monthly surveys, it could be annual surveys. So there's different kinds of surveys that we do. There's also structured questions. And when I say structured questions, I mean that they are standardized. And these questions, what they do is they are able to give us some information about what's happening for particular types of constructs that I explained earlier on. So we might look at customer satisfaction. We might look at employee engagement. So we want to know what does the employee engagement look like over time? Or yes, a survey research here. My apologies, in the top here, it should be quantitative research, not qualitative research. Um, yeah, so when we're choosing the right method, what we need is we need the following. So we need a set of objectives to define what it is that we're trying to understand in terms of the research and how we're going to go about that, and then defining the hypotheses. Now, reminding ourselves is very structured. You can't just go into this type of research just thinking, oh, well, I'll just make it up as I go. You can't. It's got to be quite clearly defined in terms of what it is that you're trying to do. Are you trying to explain a phenomenon? Are you trying to predict an outcome, as in what's going to happen in the future? Or are you explaining and testing a phenomenon based on a model? And have you got hypotheses? You'll need those basically to be able to do this type of research. So yeah, so in terms of choosing the method, you have to think about what's the type of relationship. Is it descriptive or is it causal? What I mean by that is, in terms of your research question, are you looking to explain a phenomenon and test it, or are you looking to try and explain an outcome that's a future outcome by what it is that you're collecting into the data currently? So depending on what you're doing there, you will look at either regression types of analysis if you try to explain what's going to happen in terms of future outcome, or causal relationships. If you're just looking to explain what's the current state of affairs in terms of what the current people are doing, or what the behaviors are that people are currently experiencing, we will only look at that from explaining descriptive statistics, like we explained earlier on. It's also dependent on your thinking around the availability of resources here. So Your availability of resources will confine what it is that you can do. Okay, so you are constrained around that. What's your budget, what's the time frame, and your participants. So I've said to you, well, your longitudinal research, as much as you think you might be able to do that, I don't think so, based on the fact that you are constrained around this 2-year window. Um, yes, your potential might be to look at something else, and also it's also a case of budget as well. So it's longitudinal studies might not be the go-to for you based on the fact that you don't have that time frames. Control over variables and data collection methods. So in this case, it literally is that you choose the method based on the data that you have available. So if you have got some secondary data that you can access, fantastic, go for it, use it. That's the primary kind of focus. If you haven't got it, then you're going to have to create it through primary means, meaning that you're going to do a collection of data through a survey or some other instrument. Okay. Okay. So what are you trying to achieve? Are you testing or exploring relationships? Develop your designs, and here are some examples of what it might look like. You need to think about what's the average employee job satisfaction in big pharma companies. That's descriptive. That's descriptive. Why? Well, it describes what's the employee job satisfaction in these companies. It's not looking at a more defined or nuanced approach to what it is they're looking at. It's not talking about work-life balance, and it's not looking to try and predict anything in this case. A causal objective might look at, does training impact managers' leadership ability? So what we will do here is, of course, we'll look at a study to design something that looks at managers' impact on leadership. So there might be so we'll have an experiment that's set up with a treatment group and a control group around these different leaders or managers, and then we will do some training with the one group, the treatment group, and the control group will get nothing. Okay, no treatment. And then we'll see what the difference is over time to be able to give us some kind of validity and reliability around our findings and give us some kind of base validity. Okay. Other types of research in terms of conducting it, we might look at the causal versus descriptive relationships. So investigating cause and effect relationships. For these ones, you do need experimental designs because they are going to be able to explain what's the differences in terms of your findings. And these differences in your findings have to be robust from an experiment where you are looking at trying to understand that you aren't manipulating the findings, but you are literally trying to separate out what it is that you are doing in terms of the control versus the treatment. And then you can compare and contrast these two. Definitely a causal arrangement there. Descriptive, this is without manipulating variables. So all you're doing is you're just describing what you have collected from these respondents. So another study or another investigation using causal would be exploring whether worker flexibility arrangements increase employee morale. So you might set up an experiment to be able to determine that. Okay, again, something that you'll probably do based on understanding how to organize it and looking at it over time. It's not going to be something that's going to be years. It'll probably be months or weeks. And so you'd look at that. Survey examining current employee wellness programs. So that's survey research or something internal. It's descriptive. Okay. Um, so the considerations around what you can do is dependent on what resources you have. So if we are thinking about the resources, and one of the key issues around our data collection is about our time constraints. So when it is that we wanted to collect this data, and also um, we will definitely be looking at cross-sectional if you are collecting data or using what's primary or sorry, secondary data is in that data that's already available. Budget limitations. Of course, we're limited in terms of the sample that we have. And so we won't really be looking to spend a lot of money to try and create surveys with lots of incentives, such as vouchers and stuff. We don't have that kind of access. So we also need to think about who the access is and how easy it is to access the sample that we are looking to target. So, for example, it's harder to sample CEOs than it is to sample students, right? And the reason for that, obviously, is the amount of time that they have available, as well as the fact that it's not as easy to actually access them in the first place. So yeah, so there's an example of what we need to think about in terms of time and the availability of resources. So time is one, budget is the other, and then also the access to the participants that you wanted to look at in terms of your study as well. So thinking about them in terms of the limitations. So access is a constraint which we need to think about. Not always. It just depends on what kind of sample we're looking at, okay? Control over variables. So the importance of control. So you need to be able to control for certain variables, and they needed to kind of limit the confounding factors. If we want to look at the age, gender, or level of education, for example, we use control variables for that. And so we control for the variation of these different kinds of variables. So age, gender, we have to know that obviously people with higher levels of education will have different access and different requirements compared to those with lower levels of education. And so we need to control for that in terms of how we explain what's happening in our population or in our survey or our results. So this is how we do this is through controlling for age, gender, levels of education. In our sample survey, we would do this to be able to ensure that we don't compare apples with pears. We need to be able to kind of explain what are some of these differences and why. Yeah, and then I've explained this before. So experiments allow for manipulation of variables. So literally, you can manipulate the treatment group and kind of, treat them and try and test what it is how they've changed over time. But observational studies is literally just kind of like tell us what you have or what you think, and we'll collect that data and then put it all together to be able to explain what's happening. So it's a very different kind of collection method. Um, yeah, so yeah, you would have a controlled lab experiment testing marketing strategies would be more about that you'd need to have some controls in that study around the what it is that you are trying to explain in terms of the design itself. And yeah, if you're looking at market trends, your market trends should obviously be about specific groups of people as well. Because again, we know that the market strategies are going to be different depending on whether you're female, male, whether you have got higher human capital, meaning that you've got a higher um, education and so on. So um, the key here is that you're looking at different strategies for different groups, but you've got to control for certain groups in your study. So in terms of that data collection process, then what we need is to create surveys in terms of that data that we are collecting. They need to be valid and reliable in terms of the instruments that we are creating. Um, you have to set up controls and treatment groups, and the data needs to be coded and entered correctly, ready for analysis. So this is about data cleansing at that point, okay? When we talk about this data techniques or the analysis, like I said earlier on, we've got the descriptive statistics, which looks at the descriptions of our sample groups that we have. And for that, in terms of our descriptive statistics, we look at frequency analysis, where we're looking at the mean, mode, the median, and standard deviation to summarize what is happening in our data. And from there, we can see where there are outliers and also whether the distribution is about what we expected, or whether the age distribution is out of whack and we've got mostly older people than we wanted, or and so on. So those descriptive statistics, that's what it gives us, or it helps us to understand. We then have inferential statistics, which looks at describing what's happening from the sample to the population, but we use hypothesis testing to test our relationships and also our model that we have created. Um, and there's another technique that we can use, it's called regression analysis, which looks at assessing relationships between the variables, and it can be useful for prediction. And so in prediction, basically we want to understand what's the outcome that could happen in the future. And that would be a performance outcome. So what we might look at is how the future aspect of um, how futures might be affected. So in terms of worker behavior or employee satisfaction and so on, but it's based on the data that we have. So it's not just generalized, it is about what we have from the sample, the group that we have analyzed. So there are some things that we need to think about in terms of in our data and what we've done in terms of the analysis. We need to think about, well, actually, hmm, in the data, is this the correct data? How do we know that this is analyzing the right data, and also that our results are valid and reliable? So we have these things called common threats to validity. And when we talk about validity, what we are trying to do is to try and extend to see the extent to which a research study actually measures what it intends to or claims to measure without bias or extraneous factors. So does it measure job performance, or does it measure something else? And how do we know that? If we are thinking that we want to understand job performance, um, yeah, so we need to be able to explain it and show it. So we have different ways of testing whether or not we are being valid. One is, or at least some examples of threats to the validity, is selection bias. And so this is where we selected the wrong people into our group of the sample, and therefore having an effect. History effects. So we might use the same kind of group of people just purely because we've done this before, maturation, and also the instrumentation itself. So what I mean by this is that when we get to a certain point of being able to ask or at least do these surveys in our sample, if we are thinking about what it is that we're asking, we need to still make sure that we are valid. And when I say valid, the questions that we are asking, they are still valid to the sample in terms of what they understand by what it is that we are asking about. So we can have history effects where we might think that we are asking questions in a valid way, but actually the sample has changed so dramatically, they don't understand what we're talking about in terms of the terms that we're using. So there's examples of history effects that we need to be considering. So some mitigation strategies or some kind of ways of getting around some of these and improving the validity is to use randomization. So don't just use the same kind of sample, same kind of questions. Use a combination, randomize the items so they're not only ever in the same sequence. Um, Control groups, create them, organize them, do some pre-testing. And pre-testing, we're trying to pre-test for meaning and for validity, meaning around what it is that we're asking, just the questions, and then also to check that these measures are valid for this particular sample, not for another sample, but for this one. So we confirm how well the results correspond to core theories, and also other measures of the same concept. So when we are talking about these concepts, are they the same or different? And we want to understand that by pre-testing it. So there are common threats to reliability as well. So when we talk about reliability, is the degree of which the study results are consistent over time. It needs to be secure across various samples, methods, and evaluators. And what I mean by that is that if we're asking the same set of questions, and we should get similar uh, results and findings from different samples, because we should have exactly or similar findings or results from, even if you're asking from different people, okay, or different groups. So what we do is we do some things called test and retest reliability. And this is just using a different format or form of the same kind of questions. So we might ask the questions and then change what it is slightly in terms of the questions itself and see whether or not we get similar responses. We have internal consistency checks. So we split the sample. So we can have split half in terms of the questions. We'd ask the first half and then we split it so that we'd have the second half or second group doing the first bit and so on. So we'd have that measure of the reducing what's known as order effects. Okay. Um, and then we also look at the reliability of our findings in terms of the questions that we are asking. So one of the ways of checking is to look at what's known as homogeneity or internal consistency and equivalence, right? So we establish this through using reliability using Cronbach's alpha or split half, right? So splitting out the group of items and looking at what it is that they have so that we don't have the situation where some questions are not answered by the respondents or they're not answered well, as in the back end set of questions. So we'd kind of have this test split half arrangement to try and do that. And we also check it basically to ensure that there's consistency and equivalence across the groups. Okay, so the last area that I want to cover today is around ethics and the ethical considerations within the quantitative research piece. Okay, so what is it? So we need to establish ethical considerations to ensure integrity and responsibility to our research. So in quantitative research, we look at this in terms of informed consent, data protection, and bias, which plays a critical role in maintaining our ethical standards. So we need to be non-biased. We need to be giving informed consent. And we need to be protecting the data of our respondents. So what does informed consent look like? So they must be informed about what the research is about and what is it for, but also their role, as in what are they going to be asked and what kind of content, what is it about, so they have to be clear about what it's about, but also what they need to be able to do, and then any risks involved to them personally, but also more widely to them as well. So they must be fully informed about the purpose of this piece of research, the risks, and also the procedures involved in doing the research. There needs to be some consent. The consent must be voluntary. In other words, they are doing it of their own free will. They're not being coerced. They are not being forced. They're not being bribed in any way to do the research. And they also have the option to withdraw from the research in terms of doing the survey at any one point in time whilst they also have started. So that part there, in terms of being ethical, these need to be uh, clearly worked through, and there are forms that need to be filled out in order for you to create these surveys and also to distribute and ensure that you are meeting the requirements of meeting these ethical standards around informed consent, data protection, and bias, reducing bias. That is, it's not about creating bias, but reducing bias. Okay. Um, Confidentiality is the next one. So you've got to secure the data that you are collecting because you've got to create that privacy around what it is that you are collecting in terms of sensitive information. So research must protect the identity and respondents of responses of the participants to ensure that that trust is maintained. And what I mean by that is if you are creating these data points, make sure that you don't include the respondents' names directly, create rather pseudonyms or something else. So maintain anonymity as well. So anonymization and pseudonymization techniques are common to limit that personal identification from the collected data. So what I mean by that is ensure that you create a coding scheme for each of the participants that you have. Don't use their direct information in terms of the names, especially, and identification of them. Um, okay, so ensure the confidentiality of the participants who agreed to do it. Um, so ensuring salary data is only presented in aggregate form prevents the identification of individual employees and their characteristics. This is especially the case where people have one of a kind characteristics such as high salaries, as in extremely high salaries. So if you're a CEO, your income might be 1.7 million pounds. Um, it's going to be obvious in the data if you're looking at that and kind of thinking, oh, okay, well, there's a data point that is quite high. We know more or less who that person is automatically. Your job is we're looking for aggregated information. We're not looking for the individual information. So in some cases, you might just have to think about it and think about whether or not you include those cases and how. Data protection. So this is an important aspect as well. You've got to ensure that your data is protected. So password protected, meaning that when you collect the data and you have the files, make sure that you store it in a secure server, but also in a password protected environment with backup as well. So this can either be to the cloud or something else, but make sure that it complies in terms of ensuring that that data is protected. The storage of that data is so important because you have been you have gained the trust of those people to actually answer your survey or to give you their data, their personal information. Your job is to be ethical in terms of maintaining and storing that data ethically. So ensure you take off the names and then store it properly, please. Especially when it comes to customer data that's sensitive. Please ensure that you password protect it and ensure it goes into an encrypted database. So this could be online into the cloud or something that has got some kind of backup servers. Avoid bias in your data collection. And what I mean by this is you need to consider the limitations of your own bias in terms of what it is that you are collecting and also minimize it generally. In most cases, you will need to ensure that your objective methods that you are using, that you are applying the correct method in order to manipulate the data that you are looking at. Don't try and use methods that's not robust or data that you then have and then you need to reassign it by then doing things to skew that data or to make it look better than it actually is. Work with whatever data you have, but what I would suggest is that you analyze that data using methods that's appropriate given what you have found in the literature around your literature review, but also in terms of the methods that's appropriate. So it's regression analysis, multiple regression, a structured equation model, and make sure that you are testing for reliability and validity through confirmatory factor analysis or reliability checks such as the Cronbach's alpha analysis and split half methods. It's another way, test and retest reliability. Okay, you need to ensure that you are complying by getting and gaining compliance through ethical approval. There are some forms that you will need to fill out, folks. I will come back to this again when we're talking about the data collection, but in terms of the data collection, what you need is you will need to apply and gain ethical approval. So that's specifically around the detail of what you will do. You need to show what's in the survey, and also your sample, as well as your ethical strategies that you're going to employ. So show what you're going to do and how you're going to do that. There are some issues that you need to consider when you are collecting this data. Participant burden. So just think, are you going to use all of these questions? If you are not going to use certain questions, then why ask those questions? So please make sure that you only ever include the questions in your survey that you will actually use. Participant burden is quite big, meaning that you're asking someone to do questions. Make sure that you are asking them to do the questions that you actually will use the data for. So don't think that you're just going to ask all the questions and then for some that you won't actually use it, because that's not ethical. We need you to understand that, please. Um, yes, so in some cases there should be something that suggests how you will disseminate the project results, as in what's going to be the case in terms of how you will respond to your response, as in what you're going to do, and when it will be available. Deception. So involves kind of being unethical or saying one thing, but you're actually going to do something else. You have to be clear about what you will do with the data and how you will actually analyze that data. Now, obviously, when it comes to that, you don't have to go through all the details of what you will do, but you should give you an indication about how that data will be used and what you're going to do with that data afterwards as well. So you will dispose of this data. Eventually, you need to explain how you're going to do that. Um, yeah, disregarding a participant's autonomy can lead to ethical conflicts, which is a big thing, really. Um, in the case of the surveys, it is about ensuring that people understand that they have the right to withdraw from the survey. So you do need to put that in terms of the autonomy that the respondents have. There are some imbalances, obviously, as well. If you are a manager and you're asking employees to answer your survey, think about that in terms of whether or not and how that works in terms of being ethical. Think about institutional arrangements where there might be some conflicts of interest and what you might need to do in that case. Work with your supervisor to understand whether or not there are some issues around that. If it's not, brilliant, good. If there is, have that discussion, see whether you can get around that. Um, yeah, so be clear about what the guidance is that you are giving around the ethical support, and also what you will be doing in terms of checking and establishing sensitivity around the reliability and validity of the data, but also the ethical considerations that you will ensure through the process of doing your research, such as keeping the data stored securely, privately, making the data anonymous, and ensuring that you will provide aggregate data in terms of when you're talking about the outputs. Okay. So in terms of the conclusions then for the session, the ethical considerations are essential for credibility and reliability and validity, right? You need to establish that you have provided and secured informed consent through the forms that you need to get filled out. You are going to ensure a process of data protection. You're going to ensure that you are elaborating in that process of selection of your data so that it is going to be unbiased. And that's important from the perspective of quantitative research. Um, you need to adhere to the guidelines to protect both researchers and participants, while contributing the integrity to your whole program as well as in your DBA. Okay, I think that's us for today, just in terms of kind of like the overall arrangement. What we did was we spoke about the quantitative research methods in the session today. And what I'm hoping is that you will understand that this is the first aspect around how the design works in terms of the data collection, and also things to think about in terms of the objectives, as well as the research question and how that informs what type of research in terms of the quantitative research you're going to do, um, and what methods are appropriate for that in terms of the study design that you're choosing in terms of the quantitative. And then we spoke about some of the methods and how that methods work, so the analysis. And then towards the end, we spoke about the ethical considerations and what we need there. I think now, I don't think that there's anyone on the call that's got any questions. If there are questions, go for it. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up there. Okay. Okay. Thanks, folks. Have a good day. Okay. There's no one to take any surveys. So we'll stop there.